Hello, I'm Luna Centifanti, and this here with me is Dr. James Negen of Durham University, soon to be Liverpool John Moores.
Woo!
So we're going to go through, what's the plan, kind of what is science, what's the scientific method, how is it applied. This is a session for just beginning. So we're going to leave out a lot of jargon, and it's going to be a lot more about the concepts and trying to understand those. It's going to give you a very beginning kind of introductory textbook kind of research methods kind of outline. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm just going to take our faces off of here and go to the slides. So I've called it Thinking Like a Scientist. Critical skills for evaluating and planning research. So it should also build some of your critical thinking skills to evaluate research findings, research proposals, and also give you an idea about how science is done and how we come up with research questions and how we then test those research questions using various methods. So I'll just get onto my slides. So science is a search for truth. Some people call it epistemology. So to think like a researcher, you have to be skeptical. A lot of researchers think about ideas or read about literature and are skeptical and have a skeptical attitude towards those. It doesn't mean that they don't believe anything, but they want to see it before they believe it. And usually they want to see it happen again and again before they believe it, and usually under different conditions than someone's own choosing. So that means that research is replicable, that it has been replicated again and again. And usually it's a skeptical attitude about whether the causes that are being claimed in some study or some event outside in the real world, whether it could be caused by something other than what people are claiming it to be caused by.
Yeah, like another way I've heard it explained is what you do is you think about if you didn't believe what you believe, what would you do to prove it? And then you try and do that yourself.
And all of us, are kind of mini researchers. A lot of us observe people in the outside world and what they're doing, what their behavior is, and make hypotheses or theories about what underlies that behavior. So a lot of us do this all the time. What separates us from science is when we develop a skeptical attitude and actually do things in a systematic way, observe in a systematic way. So even my child a couple days ago said to me, I think middle siblings and sole children in families are similar in certain kinds of attitudes and behaviors. That's, quite a testable thing to look at. It's probably based on some observations that they made at, age 13. So, that's a budding scientist right there, perhaps. But it takes more than just going, I think that these, siblings are the same as only children. So as I kind of previewed, the characteristics of scientific and non-scientific or everyday kind of observations is the way that it's approached and the way that it's systematic. So non-scientific is intuitive. You might trust your intuition about what you think is true about, for example, men or women. And in scientific terms, it's usually an empirical process, so something where they're engaged in, well, we'll get into that later, in scientific process. The attitude in non-scientific is uncritical or accepting. It may be that you tend to accept what you already believe, so you accept data or research or claims that already kind of are aligned with what you already believe. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's quite true of humans. And in scientific process, we develop a critical and skeptical attitude. Observations are casual and uncontrolled in non-scientific and are hopefully controlled and systematic and scientific. The reporting is in non-scientific way is biased and subjective, and hopefully in scientific is we look for unbiased, objective truths. And the concepts for non-scientific are usually ambiguous with a lot of different meanings. And in scientific, you have clear definitions and operational specificity. So that's really just meaning the same thing. Clear definitions, specific definitions that can't be aligned to something else. The instruments in non-scientific aren't inaccurate or imprecise. Maybe you're just watching people as you go about your day at lunchtime, which could be different than what people behave like at other times of the day. The instruments in scientific are accurate and precise. The measurements are different as well, being non-valid or valid, and hypotheses are either untestable or testable. So again, we do this as humans, but science is more systematic and critical.
Yeah, it's kind of in a way, it's a process that's a little bit humbling. You have to give up just sort of being like the all-knowing expert and instead go to a system where it's based on evidence, which is not to say that the scientists themselves and their perspective and all that is unimportant, not at all. But you do kind of, by doing this, sort of go over to something where you're trying to make it that the observations and the arguments themselves are really solid instead of being based more on your own ethos.
And I think part of that is just being, as a scientist, aware of what your ethos are. So it's not that it's unbiased or objective all of the time. It's really difficult for scientists to take themselves out of the research because they're humans.
Oh, yeah.
And we all make mistakes. But it's about knowing what your biases are before you undertake it, or including other scientists in your research as collaborators who are maybe taking a diverse point of view. So I've just recently collaborated with two men who hadn't even considered including women in a study that I thought was really important to include. But, if they hadn't had me on board kind of arguing why that would be important, and to be fair to them, the research on this topic typically only includes men. So, they were following what previous research has done, but I think that's the benefit of having different points of view is that you get to know what your bias is and maybe to question it and understand if it's something that you should actually rally against or it's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, you're never going to have zero bias, but through the use of multiple perspectives and while designing the research, you can reduce it a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll go on to the next one. So, as it said, science is empirical, and you can kind of think about empirical being about evidence, right? And you can kind of think about a trial or a criminal investigation if you've ever watched. I used to watch a lot of crime, dramas, and I thought they were really fun. And I guess part of that was that I thought it was really interesting about how they gather evidence and how they evaluate that evidence. And usually, again, it's, they're collecting evidence. They're looking to see if it's corroborated. So are they finding multiple avenues that give them the same answer? So if they're looking at DNA and it's giving them the same thing as like a witness testimony and the same thing as, all kinds of things. So they're looking for different sources. And that's the next one, the different sources of evidence with their own reliability. So we know that witness testimony is not that reliable. DNA has a lower chance of error depending on how it was collected. And so all those things can then tell you about the different, how those sources are given weight or reliability. And then it tells us about the probability that they are guilty with different levels of evidence. So a small amount of evidence might be enough to suspect. A large amount of evidence would be enough to convict, right? So, and you can see, I just copied and pasted this from the internet, but, the kind of like, well, if there's reasonable doubt, clear and convincing evidence, preponderance of evidence, and each of these talk about the trustworthiness, the reasonableness of the information, that it's not based on a hunch or a guess. Again, that kind of intuition, that would be really evidence that's not given very much weight if it's a suspicion or a hunch. unless it's corroborated by something that's a little bit more substantial. So that just gives you an idea of how the two kind of line up together. So to talk about the scientific method, as I said, the search for knowledge or process of gaining knowledge is epistemology. And throughout time, from very, very long time ago, thousands of years ago, humans have used faith, intuition, common sense, logic, passive observation, and the scientific method. And I don't know that it's always gone in that linear order. Sometimes it seems like we've gone backwards and forwards.
So it's a tree. It's a tree. It kind of branches back into itself. Yeah. Well, for a lot of things, you can't slow down and take a scientific method, right? Like I can't do a study to figure out which kind of coffee I like better from Tesco because I've got things to do and I need to buy coffee and get on with it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes, and actually those things could probably come before or after each other within a single thinking session of a researcher.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Like you go, oh, I've seen this thing, I have an intuition about it. I'm going to go see what kind of literature is out there, if anyone's tested this before, has anyone looked at this before, and then, and then test it out yourself using a scientific process.
Yeah.
Not a single session, but you know what I mean? Like these things can coexist nowadays in the research process.
Right. And maybe it's worth calling out too that sometimes you go read something and you say like, oh, this is a really good idea, or like, this is a really interesting idea. And if this is true, it's really important for some particular kind of practice or something like that. And then you look at the evidence and you realize there are gaps in the evidence. And then you go design a study that tries to just sort of re-examine the same idea that's already been out there, but examine it better, examine it more rigorously. And sometimes you find out it holds up. And you know what? You're still very much contributing to the way the scientific process is supposed to be, right? The attitude here is we want things to be based on as much and as solid evidence as we can to believe them. So if you just come across a good idea that you think hasn't been tested properly and you go test it properly, you are making a huge contribution to science still.
Yeah. But even like just talking about the intuition and common sense part, my colleague, Mina Lyons at Liverpool, does a lot of like interesting research. And I think she did some stuff on Tinder, and how...
Same thing.
People... just pick up random people. On Tinder, a lot of people lie, right?
Oh, uh-huh.
I'm not on Tinder. But I've heard, there's quite a big population who don't exactly tell the truth and have the... maybe present the best part of their pictures and things like this.
Is that not all of Tinder? It sounds like every part of Tinder.
Yeah, and my lawyer friend does a lot of research on this as well, but from a different point of view. Mina is more interested in personality. So she was interested in whether people who lie a lot, I should have looked up the study right before doing this, but anyway, it was about like noticing that maybe liars on Tinder, or frequent liars on Tinder, might be more kind of higher on the dark triad, so Machiavellianism, psychopathy, narcissism, and yeah, so she did some research on that to find out, because there hadn't been anything. I mean, Tinder's quite new,
right?
At least to scientists. The nerds were like, oh, what's this thing? So yeah, the scientific method is based on then gathering that evidence, analyzing it, so being very analytical, but also being critical of the way you've done it, because when you're designing a study and doing it that you haven't designed the perfect study.
Right.
So you have to be critical of your own research, and having no skin in the game and avoiding bias is the best way to do that, because
right.
I think once you think this is do or die, that's gonna introduce that bias and make you not question what you found. And then peer agreement, so seeking agreement by other people in the same field, that's part of the scientific method as well. So we have things like your peers comment on your research and give you advice on what to do next or how to improve it. And we want these results, again, to be found again and again and under different circumstances. And we want the results to be generalized to the real world or applied in some way to the real world. Otherwise, what's the point of doing the research? I mean, it has to at least be applied to a scientific advancement, like you were saying. You know, you're still advancing science if you're improving on basic science that has been done in the past, or improving on
improving the level
treatment interventions or something like this.
Improving the level of evidence or current theory. Right. I mean, maybe a way to think about it is like we showed you that staircase earlier. You don't always jump from the bottom stair to the top stair in one study. You know, like there's this thing called Bell's inequality in physics, which was a theorem that was brought up by someone in like the late 60s sometime, and it predicted a specific like physical phenomenon at the quantum level. And basically, physicists are still revising experiments to try and find out if this is true or not. There have been so many cycles where someone said, "Oh, I've proved that quantum particles really do this Bell's inequality thing," and then someone else looked at it later and realized, well, there's a little problem here. It could be this instead. And they've done this over and over again for decades. And I don't know, who knows if they'll ever be completely satisfied that this is a true property of physics while I'm still around to watch it, right? But yeah, you want to try the science involves a kind of leap out and leap into the general, right? So you have some kind of general principle, and then you leap out of the general into the specific. You say, we're going to do this specific study. And then you want to be able to leap back into the general and say, we think this means something generally, which is why, that step there is sort of an abstraction, a generalization, and that's why scientific research is ongoing, right? We always want to know more to be able to test that further.
Great. Let's move on to the next one. So science doesn't, I think we've said this, scientists don't exist in a vacuum. Science involves humans observing and analyzing. So as humans, we make mistakes, or as humans, we are biased. So there's at least three contexts to consider when you're considering scientific research, and their context is historical context, sociocultural, and moral context. So historical being things like, what was going on, what was the political context of the time, and why did that research take place in that time, and what research hadn't been done in that time because of the political context. So, nowadays I think there's a lot more, for example, Black researchers doing research that is much more relevant and takes into account different factors than people had been thinking of before. The research that took place during World War II,
right, under
Nazi regime, was maybe related to kind of how we think about how some people are saying today about looking at who's the best fit kind of person.
Right.
So I think understanding that, there's also the social cultural aspect. So, for example, I just was a couple years ago heard about this study. I can post like some references after I post this video, but the marshmallow test. I don't know if you heard about it, but kids were asked to have. Well, usually, sometimes it was done with M&Ms, marshmallows. So they're given one item that they really like and asked to sit in front of it and wait for 1 or 2 minutes until the experimenter, or as sometimes parents do who are psychologists do to their own children, wait until the adult comes back and says, oh, you've waited all this time, you can now have 2. So they're told in the beginning, you can have 1, or if you wait this amount of time, you can have 2. So basically, it's what they call delay gratification. You're delaying the gratification that you're going to get from eating the marshmallow or one M&M. And what they found was that kids who were able to delay gratification had better outcomes in adulthood with the kinds of jobs that they were getting, the kind of money that they were making, those sorts of things. So I think a lot of people had studied this since, I don't know, I think the first study was in the 70s or 80s.
70s or 80s, yeah. And I know where you're going with this, and then it turns out I haven't heard this, but I'm going to guess that turns out it depends on the sociocultural context in which the population actually lives, right? So if you do that with one group of people, it's predictive of who's going to be making more money later in life, and if you do it with a different group of people, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Is that the punchline?
Basically.
Called it! Called it!
So kids who, you can imagine, if you live in poverty, for example, you're going to take things as you have them.
Right.
Because you don't know when you're going to get that thing again. You eat your meal now because you don't know when you're going to have your next meal.
Right.
You're not going to, savor that for like a few days. You don't know when it makes a different kind of strategy, which is not inborn. Mm-hmm. It's something you've learned because of the way that, these things that you want are given to you.
Right.
They're paced in that way. In the same way that people would get, if you're not American, but people would get like welfare checks or get their allowance for the month who were poor from the government. They'd get some amount of money, and people would get people who weren't poor would be like, why are they spending all their money right away? Because they're not going to get another check until the beginning of next month. But when you have so little, it's really hard to understand. It's, as a person who has a lot, it's really hard to understand what a poor person's going through when they have a little and they get more at certain times of the month. And in the same way, these kids are responding in the way that they are situated in a poor family. So for people that were rich, the marshmallow test had no information, no explanation of their outcomes as adults. So really it was, if you were rich, you were going to do well as an adult.
Right.
If you were a rich kid. If you were a poor kid, you weren't going to do so well as an adult, but it had nothing to do with the delay of gratification. It was just basically like, this is a systemic problem of being poor.
Right.
So once you can kind of control for or look at the SES, the socioeconomic status that these people are living in, then that had no predictive, the SES had more predictive ability than their delay of gratification. Yeah,
very practical hint here, something that comes up a lot in psychology in practice is like, you want to think about if you're going to do a study with, on undergraduates at the university, you want to think about whether or not that's something that you're studying, you want to think about whether or not the thing you're studying is something you expect to be a pattern that will be the same in college students versus other populations, and you want to think about that when you're interpreting it. That comes up a lot.
Yeah, so I think it's also important to think about, again, if you hadn't thought about another variable, another, socioeconomic status in that study wasn't thought of. So there was an alternative explanation for their study. It wasn't, and some of it's kind of sad because you think about 20, 30 years of this study going on. We thought it was delay of gratification. We thought it was how much grit a child had to whether they would succeed, and what I think, what's important to us at the University of Liverpool in Department of Clinical Psychology is that kind of social justice ideas, that a lot of these things are systemic. And so maybe a lot of people had spent time in schools going, you need to develop the skills to delay gratification, when that wasn't going to help any poor child get ahead in life. So it's, these things, I get really upset when I think about that, because it's just such a shame that we spent time then applying this to the real world.
So what's a moral context?
So moral contexts are ethics. So we have to think about the ethical implications of our research. Part of that, example about the marshmallow test is ethical in that you've maybe wasted a lot of research, a lot of participants' time in doing a study that really didn't get us to an answer. So there's that. But in my research, for example, and something that will be considered in any clinical psychology research is about informed consent. So we want people to understand the nature of the research that we are doing and to like actively volunteer to do it.
Preach.
So it's really hard to get children to understand research and consent to it. So this is why we have a really careful way of asking their parent or guardian about whether they consent, but also asking the child if they want to do it in a way that they understand. So seeking child assent. But the same thing is true when I do research in prisons. The consent process is really involved because we need them to understand and not to feel coerced.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? To do it.
Yeah.
So it's any vulnerable populations that we really need to seek to make so this is, a skill that hopefully when we're talking about research, we need to be able to talk about it in a way that anyone could understand it and to make it in the language of the people that we're dealing with. So, I mean, you read a lot of consent forms that are really heavy in jargon, have citations to research, and I understand, students and trainees really want to be thorough and kind of be like, look, you can read the background research, but it's really important to be clear in those. You work with children.
I mean, sometimes with children is an example where you can even redesign the study slightly to make it easier to, not easier is not the right word, to make it so that children can give better informed consent. So I've done studies with spatial memory using virtual reality that I have designed so that I can just tell, a 4-year-old, you put this on and we play hide and seek with a virtual duck. Do you want to play? Right? So I haven't explained, I haven't given them any citations and things because they're 4, right? But basically at that point they understand what they're actually going to be doing, and I, generally get quite enthusiastic consent to that one. But you could design that study in a way that it wasn't a hide and seek game with a duck. Is a different spatial memory task. So there's a lot to go on with this.
And then you rely on parents being able to make those decisions, or guardians to make those decisions, or sometimes if they're in a residential facility, I might have to get consent from, or in loco parentis, which is kind of somebody acting in the way that a parent would. So sometimes a head teacher is like that in maybe a residential school. Or I've worked in detention centers where the kids have been found had to commit a crime or possibly committed a crime, but they haven't been tried and found guilty of that crime, but they're being held because they're a risk or whatever. In that case, we have to get consent from the juvenile justice services, the people at the detention center, and then also get consent from the parents either by phone. So, I mean, a lot of this takes, I would say, there's more to ethics. There's things about risks and things like that. But I think a large part of any clinical research, for example, involves how do we get consent in a way that is not coerced?
Yes.
How do we not make the incentives too much that people can't say no.
Right.
So I remember I participated in a study where they were going to give me $20 for giving them blood to test and do research on. And, for me as a student, $20 was a lot of money. So I just did it because of the money. I didn't actually do it because I cared about, I don't even remember what the research was about. So I think there has to be some kind of balance, and maybe, and that's why a lot of places make contingencies about you can't put the amount of money that's going to be involved on the posters or any advertisements, things like this. So it's a big part to think about, and it's something that you'll probably pay attention to as you're looking at research. But you'd have to know what they did. So we kind of gave you an idea about selecting a research question. Sometimes you just observe something like, how people behave on Tinder, or people behave in a crisis, like a pandemic.
Don't have any idea what you're talking about, Luna.
But like you said, we can also read literature where we then see a study and we go, wait, they did it like that? I think that it would be better if they did it
like this,
some other way.
Yeah. Corroborate it.
Or you might have, for my case, I have people working in the NHS who say, I've got a problem within, not a problem, but like I have some question, some issue that I'm really interested in that's happening in my service. And it's either something just to understand the problem, or sometimes it's to solve the problem. But you think of a practical problem, or someone comes to you with a practical problem, and you, as the scientist, knows how to go through the literature, and using your expertise can then go, oh, okay, let's think about a really well-designed study to think about that problem and to actually research it rather than just observing it.
Yeah. And I mean, also, again, I'd like to just kind of gently point out that, like, when you think of a practical problem, it's possible that problem will be really big and that you're not going to be able to solve it in one study. You want to, I think successful scientists get in the mindset of making progress.
Yeah.
Right? You want to be further along than you were before the study started. And that doesn't always mean that you've got it solved, especially if you take on really big problems. Like I've been working with blind people in human echolocation, and we've been wanting to know more about what it's like to learn a new way to use your senses when you're already an adult. You're not going to solve that in one study. I'm probably not going to solve that in my lifetime.
Yeah. I think a lot of trainees come to me and want to do like really big studies. You know what I mean? Like so they say, well, there's this problem, and as they go along, the study gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then I have to just go, okay, let's pare this down because we can't do all that. So yeah, it's really important. And then I just say, another trainee will do that in the future. But yeah, it's really frustrating to think like, you want to do something bigger. But you have to think about why this research question is a good one. So to consider that, researchers think about the scientific, the clinical importance, the scope of it, again, like how big, how little, the likely outcomes of the research. So what are you likely to find, and how are you then going to communicate that? What's I always say, like, what's going to be your take-home message from it? And then whether psychological science will be advanced. So these are some questions that I found in a book, which was about and then I edited them, so they're slightly reworded. So why might this question be important? What is the scope of the question? What are the likely outcomes if I carry out this project? To what extent will knowledge be advanced? So that can be clinical knowledge, research, theory, anything like that, by the answer to this question. And then who would be interested in the results that I would obtain? So who is it going to impact, or who is going to be interested? So again, that could be other theorists or scientists, or it could be the public, it could be policymakers.
We're shooting high now, aren't we? Policymakers, pulling out the big guns. I mean, that's the dream, if you actually get someone who's in a policy-making position to actually do something different because of a study you did.
Yeah.
That's when you made it. And I think it's worth pointing out, this to me kind of links back to ethics. Like, you're asking people to volunteer their time and their effort and like a little tiny slice of their life to participate in your study. And if you have no idea what use this study could ever be, if you can't answer who will be interested in the results obtained, I feel like it's a little bit unethical. Like, you're asking people to give up a little piece of themselves and their time and everything. You have a responsibility to know why you're doing that. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, so that's how research questions get posed. And I think even some of our trainees, a couple, will think of a research question, put it through to a proposal, and then have to change the research question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, or maybe just modify it a little bit so that it does have those results be interesting. Because maybe before that they were very niche.
Right.
And anything that's really, really niche to like a particular service. So one particular clientele, with service users within the NHS, for example. So just a Manchester service might not be something that we would like for a clinical doctorate thesis, for example, to be done. But there are other ways that those questions can be answered if you're doing, a small scale evaluation of a service. That happens, but is usually not part of a doctorate. So that's where these things kind of get, jiggled a little bit to match the scope of a DCLIN project. So we do think about that as well. We talked a little bit about biases and things like that. So, people talk about those as being paradigms. How you think about the world. And yeah, I think given where you come from, what you've studied, where you've studied, a lot of those things can influence the paradigms that you bring. And also the subject that you study, right?
Oh, yeah.
So psychology... when I was doing my degree, I was doing psychology with a minor in sociology. So I was very much interested in the social structures, how people behave as a society, culture, all of that I thought was really interesting. So I did a lot on sociology. And also when I was doing my PhD, I studied a lot in criminology as well, which is kind of part of sociology. So I think my views are like a blend of psychology, criminology, sociology, which means that, the way that I think of, for example, I gave an example from my own research, juvenile delinquency. You can think of that as, being a lot of different things. It could be that somebody thinks of it as as functionalism. So it serves a purpose.
Yep.
Some people talk about, we have a lot of juvenile delinquency in certain societies where we ask children who reach puberty but have to wait until they're 21 or 18 to be able to do a lot of adult things. So there's this kind of maturity gap that people like Tammy Moffat talk about. And so that's part of the functionalism. It's a way for them to go, I'm an individual, I'm unique, I'm like an adult, and I want to be treated that way. Therefore, I'm going to smoke or drink or, something like this. So that's very kind of functionalist. An interaction between your environment and yourself. Some people think of it very much as a personality deficit, and that's it. Or some people look at just like the genes involved or heritability of delinquency. Some people, a lot of people combine these things, but there are kind of paradigms where you go, where your first thought might be, let's study this thing. Let's study the social structures. Let's study poverty. Let's study. So you have to be really mindful of the way that people are telling their kind of scientific story.
Yeah. I mean, basically what a paradigm does in this case is it gives you sort of a vocabulary to even try and make a theory out of, right? So, if you're looking at interactionism, then a lot of what, so if you're using the term the way I'm familiar with it, that's talking a lot about gene-environment interactions.
Part of it, yeah.
Right.
I think these terms are a little bit older, but yeah.
Okay. I thought it was kind of an old term, but anyway, then that's sort of your vocabulary for even making a theory, right? You're going to start asking questions about genes and environments.
Yeah.
Right? That's what's going to form it. Whereas another person might, for example, approach it with a different paradigm where they end up asking questions about social hierarchies.
Yeah. And then that determines exactly how they're going to design their study. And they're going to find different things, and they're going to have a different answer.
Right.
And they're going to conflict. Those answers might conflict. You know what I mean? And because they haven't tested each other's theories.
Yeah.
But, no one's gone over and been like, "Hey, somebody who doesn't believe in my theory, can you come over here and test it?" I mean, it's good when those things happen, but they don't always happen.
Yeah. Ideally, two scientists working under different paradigms would end up with results that are compatible with each other, like sort of just different ways of describing the problem. But in reality, we're humans.
Yeah.
So, it is good to have multiple perspectives informing your research whenever possible.
Yeah. So I think it's good. We put a question at the bottom. What are your paradigms to think about these things? How do you think about when you, view a parent disciplining their child in public? What are your paradigms for that? How do you, initially think about that? Because that's going to tell you about what you think about the world. for example, like I was saying about juvenile delinquency, I mean, there's different ways of thinking about delinquency. This, one way is kind of thinking about it like it originates from childhood and, is based on like you said, a gene environment interaction. So, starts with a fussy temperament and tantrums, and then turns into, fighting and breaking and entering and other, and leads to antisocial behavior as an adult. So it depends on what your paradigm is for that. And do you think that's mainly an environmental issue, a genetic issue, or a heritability issue? All those things are going to influence the way that you design your studies then, and what you decide to measure. So the next part in designing your research question is then how you're going to test it. Are you going to seek to describe the phenomena, or predict what's going to happen, or identify causal relationships? And all those are more quantitative types of research studies. So they, end up with some kind of numbers to test. Or whether you want to understand people's perspectives or experiences using their own words, rather than trying to categorize them using, research studies that have happened in the past. And those are more qualitative research studies. So they're more about the quality of the data, I guess, rather than the quantity of a number that you get. So I'm going to talk about quantitative first. So you could choose an observational correlational design for looking at description or prediction, an experimental design for answering any kind of causal research question, so whether one thing causes another. A single case design is very rare, but that's when you're seeking to understand and treat one individual. I have seen studies in my field like that, but they're very rare. Or a quasi-experimental design, which is for causal research questions where you don't have full control over what environment people are in.
Right.
So we'll go a little bit more into those to give an example. So giving a description, for example, researchers define, classify, catalog, or categorize events and relationships to describe mental processes and behavior. An example would be psychologists describing symptoms of helplessness and depression. And the next one would be prediction, where you try to identify correlations or how variables might co-vary with each other. So as one goes up, the other one goes down, or as one goes up, the other one goes up, but all those kinds of things. So how they're able to predict mental processes and behavior. So for example, as level of depression increases, individuals exhibit more symptoms of helplessness. And that's just kind of establish whether helplessness is related to depression. And then explanation, researchers understand a phenomenon when they can identify the cause. So participants exposed to unsolvable problems become more pessimistic and less willing to do new tasks, so become more helpless than participants who are asked to do solvable problems. So that would be an experimental design, because they're asked to do something different and you're controlling what they're being asked to do. And then application. So psychologists apply their knowledge to change people's lives for the better. So maybe treatment that encourages depressed individuals to attempt tasks that can be mastered or easily achieved, hopefully would decrease those feelings of helplessness and pessimism. So that would be the treatment application of this research.
Right. So maybe a good thing to point out is for this description prediction, when you do these studies, you're not changing anything about the participants. You're just seeing what's there.
Yeah.
Right? And in description, you're just describing what's there. In prediction, you're just figuring out what things you're seeing go with what other things. Whereas an experiment, you're actually manipulating something.
Yeah.
So that's an important distinction.
Yeah. With description and prediction, you're kind of like, these are naturally occurring things.
Yeah, you'll sometimes...
And you're observing them and noting them in some way.
Yeah, you'll sometimes hear people use the term natural experiment, which means that we're doing a correlational study, but we just can't admit it to ourselves.
Yeah. So these are kind of some of the research studies that I've done. I've done virtual reality, having kids do a roller coaster and testing their heart rate. And and eye tracking, looking at where people look on a face to determine if they're happy or sad. What parts of the face do they look at to determine happy, sad, scared? Some observational studies where babies are playing with their mums, and we're looking at what kind of language the mums are using when they talk to their kids. And also looking at aggression with a computer task. So I call it aggression, but you're taking points away from your opponent in response to them taking points away from you. So we'll kind of talk about operationalization and how well that's done, but that just gives you some ideas. So yes, operationalization, once you have a research topic and a research question, will you be able to answer it with a certain kind of research design, and how? So for example, with mine looking at aggression, I looked at how many points they took away from their opponent. So I then asked them to say how often they are aggressive. So again, I can get a number. And then I had them play that game, and I looked at how many points they took away from their opponent. So again, I had a number out of that. And then I could look at the correlation between those two. And actually, as the more they said that they are an aggressive person, the more points they took away from their opponent on this game that I observed in the moment. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of giving, this is how I am in real life, on an everyday basis. And then I found that in a game when they were sat there. Mm-hmm. So then you have to think about the strengths and weaknesses of the various options, right? So in my study, for example, they're giving a self-report about their aggressiveness. And it could be that someone who's really aggressive will lie. Mm-hmm. Or it could be that a person who's really not aggressive is like, oh yeah, I totally stand up for myself, and think of themselves as a more dominant kind of person. And so, yes, there's, it could be that they lie. The game that I gave is points taking away from the opponent, the same thing as like punching people, or, people have studied aggression, looking at how much hot sauce you give to your opponent. Is that aggression? Mm-hmm. Is it causing harm? So again, it's about understanding what we mean by these terms.
Yeah. So this is the part where like you leap from the general to the specific. Mm-mm. Right?
Yeah. So the general concept of aggression, how do you then
what do I actually
specify it? Yeah.
Yeah. And if you when you design a study, you find out that you have a million little things to do along these lines. There are just so many options.
Yeah, and everything. I think when I was saying about like non-scientific, mm-hmm. average human on the street, if you ask them like, do you think like, I don't know, Boris Johnson or Trump is like an aggressive person? Like, I think we don't operationalize our terms to each other, right? So you can ask somebody on the street, like, do you think intelligence is inborn or like learned?
I think intelligence is an invalid concept, but go on.
But like an average person would probably do like a whole mental gymnastics with you and go like, well, I think it's, whatever. And they would make a huge claim about it. And then when you ask them like, well, what do you mean by intelligence? Different people would have completely different definitions about what they mean. Or maybe they'd even be able...
definition.
And no definition. They're just like, I know what it is when I see it.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I think, it's useful for scientists to have a good definition that's really specific, and to agree that those are the concepts.
That's the point here, right? Is we already do plenty of like skating along on kind of half-formed definitions and things, because that's how you get through life. That's how I actually, am standing here and, dealing with everything occurring around me, because you don't have time to apply the scientific method to everything. But, when we are taking the time to breathe and do this, it's really important to make sure we actually know what it is we're talking about and what that means in practice in the study.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So, you can have a go at what you would do if you wanted to study the effects of caffeine on energy level. How could you do that as a correlational study? How could you do that with an experiment with a manipulated independent variable? So that's, where you take caffeine and maybe give some people a lot of caffeine and give some people no caffeine, but like a drink that's decaffeinated, just so that you keep it the same. How could you do this with an experiment with a measured not manipulated caffeine variable. So you could ask people how much they drank that day and then ask them to perform some task or any kind of thing like that. Or how could you do it qualitatively? So maybe asking people about how they think caffeine affects them and how they are when they don't have caffeine, maybe when they've been ill and they've had to get off tea and coffee and how that has been for them. What's their, life experience of having done that. So yeah, there's a lot of, once you have a research question, I guess the point of this is that there's so many different ways that you can then design a study to answer that question. And then after you design the study and perform the study, you're then analyzing the data. So again, you were talking about those abstractions and then specifications and then going back to the broad generalizations. So most psychologists try to establish broad generalizations and general laws that apply to a diverse population. So that's what you're hoping to do, broaden out from that one study. And so to accomplish this, psychology studies often involve large numbers of participants. You want to be able to abstract to the general population. So you have to have enough participants that it's going to be relevant to a large population. And a lot of times we describe the average or typical performance of the group that we're interested in. So their average level of aggression or their average level of energy. And this average may or may not describe the performance of any one person in that group.
Right, yeah.
So this is called a nomothetic approach. And I saw in a textbook, they were looking at, is it not here? They were looking at averages across different people in different countries and how much, how fast they walk and things like that. But we'll show you that in a minute. But that's contrasted with the ideographic approach, which pertains to individuals rather than groups. So case studies, some qualitative work. We'll have, one of my trainees is doing a study with 6 people to do a qualitative study, which involves, at least an hour-long interview with them to understand their experience. So researchers who use an ideographic approach recognize that people behave in ways that conform to general laws, so they don't deny that there are generalizable principles and processes that humans do, but they want to understand the uniqueness of individuals as well. So the two complement each other.
Yeah.
You have, quantitative or, more nomothetic work, and then you have ideographic work to complement that and to be able to show a nuanced behavior.
Yeah, so a good monothetic research kind of catches the most people, and good ideographic researcher makes sure no one falls through the cracks.
Yeah, exactly. So this was what I was talking about, to give an example. So this is looking at walking speed in different countries, postal clerk speed in processing their daily work, and bank clocks. And looking at how accurate and the speed of performing tasks. And you can see that some places had a more kind of a greater speed of movement and greater accuracy. And those were places like the United States and Japan, which are more fast-paced. So they talk. The way that they operationalized, or the way that they then used a more generalized or abstract concept, was to talk about the pace of life in a country.
Right.
So that's what they ended up calling this, is that Japan and the United States have a greater pace of life.
Yeah.
In a country. So again, you can argue whether, walking speed, accuracy of bank clocks, and postal clerks' processing speed of their daily tasks is a pace of life for a whole country. But, the researchers didn't say any one person in the United States or Japan is going to be, have a high pace of life. But it describes an average. And then also you'd have to think about, are these things representative of a pace of life? Or what would you think indicative of pace of life.
Well, yeah, I feel like here also we should have a quick call back to historical context, right?
Yeah,
probably.
Exactly.
This was published in 1990 when like the bank having an accurate clock was important.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it'd be shocking if any institution didn't have an accurate timepiece anymore, right?
Yeah. Exactly. But yeah, I think so. This is the kind of thing that would be more nomothetic, right? So how do you analyze these different tasks if you're looking at kind of nomothetic and more quantitative measures?
Mm-hmm.
And this is just to give you an idea of when you read something, or the most, kind of common statistical techniques that we use. So if you suspect that there are differences between groups, so for example, people from different countries, that's more than 2 groups, then you'd probably do an ANOVA, analysis of variance.
The worst acronym in all of psychology. Someone turned analysis of variance into ANOVA.
If you only had 2 groups, then you'd do a t-test. So yeah, ANOVA and t-test are to look at the differences in averages between groups. And correlations, so a Pearson's bivariate correlation, for example, would be to look at whether a change in one variable is associated with a change in another variable. And that's to look at 2 variables. If you have more than 2 variables, people usually look at things like regression. So if you see regression, multiple regression, hierarchical multiple regression, then that's what they're doing. They're still looking at associations.
Yes.
So all the association ones are correlations and regressions. The ones having to do with analyzing groups is ANOVA and t-tests. And a lot of things are built on regression. So if you see things like a mediation effect, that'll be a regression. Yeah. If people are using, M plus or things like that, or structural equation modeling, or confirmatory factor analysis, those are all based on regression. But that's just to give you an idea of like the kind of things that we could do. We can also look at things like a chi-square, which is looking at whether frequencies differ among kind of bins.
Yeah. That's
so whether like if you're a man or woman and either young or old, whether a young person who's a woman differs from an old person who's a man or something like that. So you can look at like different frequencies, but those are a little bit less common in this work that we're talking about.
T-tests, ANOVAs, and regressions make up like 95% of psychology.
Yeah, exactly. So just to give you an idea of a t-test, for example, this is a study that I kind of just copied their means and just graphed it for you. So I would say you'd rather show this as a bar graph, but anyway, this is fine. So this was how much interviewers expended effort to obtain a confession from a suspect. And either the interrogator had a guilty suspicion or expectation or an innocent expectation. And you can see that they put a lot more effort into obtaining a confession when they thought that the person was guilty than when they thought they were innocent. However, in ANOVAs, you can do an interaction. So you can see whether another variable added in, whether it then changes this line right here that we've seen.
Ooh, two-way.
So this shows an interaction between interrogator expectation and the actual suspect's guilt or innocence in an effort to obtain confession. So it takes these numbers and splits them up into the 2 groups of actual guilt or actual innocence. So when they're actually guilty, the effort to obtain a confession, whether the interrogator expectation is guilty or innocent, doesn't change. But when the person's innocent, you can see that quite a bit between a guilty expectation versus an innocent expectation. So an innocent person is more likely to have more effort expended, possibly because of the way that they're behaving and they're being really, I should cooperate because I'm not guilty. And so this shows that there could be an interaction. So the effect really doesn't affect people who are guilty. They're, probably behaving the same. They've probably had more experience with police officers and their interrogation methods. So, the kind of effort to obtain a confession is equal across the two kind of expectations of the interrogator for those kinds of people. But it's the innocent that are really damaged by by sometimes cooperating with police.
It's a very interesting example of how a two-way ANOVA reveals something very important that the one-way didn't.
Yeah, so, exactly. Yep. So a lot of people might be thinking in their research studies that there might be an interaction. Some people call it a moderating effect of another variable, so you might see moderation. That's usually in regression, but it's kind of the same concept. Interactions can happen in any of those.
Math.
Same, yeah, exactly.
Same math under all those.
For prediction, it's kind of a misnomer. So as you were saying, it's really looking at an association. It's not forecasting the future.
There's no weather report for science.
So, yeah, a lot of people, I sometimes use the words statistical prediction to make that really clear that it's a statistical process. It's a math problem. Right. Correlational relationships allow psychologists to predict behavior or events. Basically, you're saying, if I know your level of depression, I might know your level of learned helplessness. Yeah. Only because we've done this study with, thousands of people, and basically people with a score of 24, on average have a helplessness score of this. So that's all it does. It's allowing you to...
And there are always exceptions.
To figure that out. Yeah, and that's just on average. So, and they might know it within a certain error, kind of rate. But yeah, it doesn't allow you to know what causes those relationships. It doesn't mean that feeling helpless leads you to have depression, or the other way around. Or the other way.
Nope. Lots of other options there.
So if we know your exam scores in school, we might be able to know something about how many hours you've studied. But we wouldn't really know which one is the cause and which is the effect. It might be that if you find maths really easy, then you've studied harder for it because you find it really more exciting and rewarding.
It's interesting.
It's more interesting, and you feel less hopeless doing it.
You can tell we're nerds.
Exam scores go up, or or it's the level of studying that directly, we don't know. Or it might be a third variable that leads to both of those. It might be that your parents are, rich, and so are, can get you exam help, from an outside agency. So and much of survey and questionnaire-based research relies on correlations and regressions.
Yes.
So if you see somebody who's, saying they're going to use some survey measure or questionnaire measure, it's probably the case that they're going to be doing some kind of correlation or regression. Yeah. And this, again, is just to kind of show you some kind of correlations that could happen. So in a study, who was this again? I think it was Kroll and Kidd, or maybe I'm thinking of another study. I don't know if I actually wrote down. Evans and colleagues here. So they found a correlation between poverty and psychological distress, but other people said, well, maybe that's not poverty causing psychological distress in a direct way. And they said maybe, it's the case that kind of chaotic environment relates to psychological distress and also probably relates to poverty.
Yes.
Right? So they were saying, if you haven't looked at this, And because this chaos is related to poverty, you actually don't know which one is related to psychological distress.
Yeah.
And so what they tested was, this is a mediation, they tested whether poverty was related to chaos, which then was related to psychological distress.
Yep.
And turned out that that was true. So this was a kind of mediating variable here. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So the other part is explanation. So we talked about understand. So this is where we are trying to understand the cause of a phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And the cause of a phenomenon can only happen when three things are true. There is covariation, so the two things are related to each other.
Mm-hmm.
When one happens, the other one happens in some particular way. There is a time order relationship, so one preceded the other one.
Yep.
And you eliminate other possible causes or alternative explanations. So when you design an experiment, it's then really easy to be in control of those things because you can, apply something, know the time order in which you applied it, and you can eliminate other possible causes by controlling those. So as I said, you might, if you're looking at caffeine, you might give them a coffee, but then you might want to give the other group a hot beverage that tastes of coffee, but that has no caffeine in it. Do you know what I mean? So you're trying to keep things as equal as possible. But yeah, there's the covariation. So if you bang your head and you get a headache, you banged your head first and then you got the headache. So then you know that probably banging your head gave you the headache. But then if something had happened almost at the same time that you banged your head, so you'd taken some new medication that the side effects were headaches, you actually don't know which one it was then.
Right.
So, I don't want you going around banging your head on purpose, but but these are the ways that like other alternative explanations can seep into a research study.
Yeah, and I mean sometimes so don't go hit your head, but sometimes it will feel that obvious to you. If you see two things correlated, you're like, oh, they cause each other, and sometimes we find out it's not.
Yeah.
That's why it's research. We're exploring new stuff.
Yeah, and some things you can't manipulate in research. So, for example, you can't make people impoverished.
Yeah.
So, in that case, there are other things to do, but experiments are a nice way to be able to talk about explanation. So, for example, I know a guy called Jamie Pennebaker at Austin, Texas University, and he was doing some research looking at whether people who wrote in an expressive way about a traumatic event. So a bunch of people lost their jobs, for example. He has a study about job loss, and half the people were told to write about the job loss and to write it in what are their feelings, just anything that would come up, about that. Mm-hmm. And the level of distress after they did that, so the other group were just told to write about, superficial topics.
Mm-hmm.
When they compared them, the people who wrote in an expressive writing kind of way were actually less distressed.
Mm-hmm.
And also what was interesting is that they were able to get jobs quicker.
Oh, okay. So that is still an experiment because you have manipulated the independent variable, which is what they're writing.
Yeah.
But interestingly, and you found an outcome, which is a distress.
Yeah.
But along the way, you've also got this mediator possibly going on. It could be that
they were at the same time, so
there's more to the outcome than you expected, though.
Yeah, there's more to the outcome. So it could be that if you're less distressed, you're then more motivated to go out and try to find jobs.
Get a job. Yeah.
So yeah, but it was an interesting experimental manipulation.
Yeah.
So yeah. And also so that kind of solves some world problems with those kind of informations, hopefully would have some kind of applied work. What I found interesting is this example that I found in this textbook, which is about typhoid fever and delirium tremens in the 19th century. So these typhoid fever and delirium were often fatal. And the standard medical practice at the time was things like bleeding the patient, as well as other therapies, because of course we didn't have well evidenced
right. This is like the beginning of
treatment.
medical evidence
Exactly.
in systematic scientific ways. Yeah.
Exactly. So somebody designed, I think, an experiment where they were treating people either with the standard treatment, which was bleeding or purging, or the second group, which were just told to rest in their bed, have some tea,
Go lie down,
wait for all of this to blow over.
Pretty much, yeah.
And they had good nutrition, right? And they did close observation of both groups. And they described the results of the experiment as unequivocal and appalling. The group given standard medical treatment of the time did worse than the group that was just in bed with no treatment. So early 19th century practices, treatment was worse than just lying in bed doing nothing, and letting them just recover on their own. So it is important to do these kind of experimental methods.
Oh, yeah.
Rather than just relying on, it must be bad air or bad blood. Another experiment was looking at the MA doll and other dolls that were more, so this is a size 16 US doll, which was made in the image of this supermodel. Because Barbies, as you might have noticed, are very disproportional to what real women look like. And so they did an experiment with girls.
But I actually look like the Hercules doll, right?
No. So they did an experiment with 5 to 6 year olds, and they read a book where the protagonist was Barbie, and Barbie went shopping and getting ready for a party. And in another condition, they had a different book, and it had MA doing all those things. So same things, same story, but MA was placed in there instead of Barbie.
Sounds like an experiment. What was the outcome?
No, there was a third condition.
Oh, Lord.
The third condition was that they just saw pictures of the items that were part of the shopping. So they saw like store windows with these items in them rather than someone shopping, because they wanted to eliminate the effect of, is it just having a human?
Okay.
Right?
Right.
So they had one where it was just the objects and no human. So what they found was that the girls who'd read, I'll tell you what they did to like find out what they, how the girls viewed bodies. So they had girls fill in, they had like a bunch of bodies along the top section of a piece of paper. And then they had another group of the same bodies along the bottom part. And they said, on the top one, I want you to put what you look like. So fill it in, color it in with this crayon. And then on the bottom one, I want you to choose the body that you wish you looked like. Color it in. And then they subtracted those two scores. So each of them had like a score. So they subtracted it. So a lower number would mean that you're very dissatisfied and want to be thinner. A more equal number would be that you're pretty satisfied. So your body you think is your ideal body as well.
Right.
And a high number would be that you wish that you were bigger.
Okay.
And what they found was that the girls in the MA condition and in the storybook that didn't have any people in it, both of those, they were quite satisfied with their body.
So near zero for most of them.
And for the Barbie, they were, it was a negative number. The average was negative 0.76.
Okay, not as bad as I thought you were going to say, but still not good.
I guess it's one story, right?
Right, yeah.
It's over one session.
Yeah,
it's not
I gotcha.
over like weeks or something like that.
I see.
So the one shot story led to a negative 0.76.
We can mess up girls so fast you won't even believe it.
So yeah, I think, it shows that manipulation, right? So they know kind of the cause and effect here. They gave each girl a story, right? And didn't give them different kinds of information. And they manipulated this condition, right? And kept other things constant. So they still read a story. They still, other things were kept so that they wouldn't be the thing that affected it. Yeah, and the reason why they did each condition, right? So you want the bigger doll with the Barbie doll, but you also want the different, if you'd found a difference between those, well, if you found a difference between Barbie and no doll at all, then it could be that it's just humans being involved in the story,
right.
or, human-like characters being involved in the story. So that's why you need the MA doll to compare to the other conditions. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So I thought that was a pretty well-designed study. But like you said, negative 0.76, those averages, how big are they? Are they significant? And in what way are they significant? So what do we decide to pay attention to? And how do we know that differences in group averages are worthy of that attention? So we use, in statistics for quantitative research, we use null hypothesis testing to determine whether mean differences among groups are greater than the differences that you would expect given the average error variation. And we use statistics to determine this. So usually statistical significance is set at 95% probability. But we must recognize that statistical significance is not the same thing as scientific or even clinical significance. So, is negative 0.76 going to change the way that we develop dolls and stories for children? Is it going to be clinically meaningful? Is it practically meaningful? Is it meaningful to science and the way that we're advancing our knowledge? So all these things are not equated.
Ooh, statistical power.
And they are determined by how much power we have to find differences. So statistical power refers to the likelihood that a statistical test will allow researchers to make the claims that they want to make based on statistical significance. And that's influenced by three things. The level that you've chosen for your statistical significance. Again, we don't really mess around with that. It's 95%.
That stays pretty fixed.
The size of the treatment effect. So the effect size.
You usually can't do much about.
You can't really do much about it except to choose like a robust measure or something like this. And the sample size.
There's the one we can change.
Yeah. So the primary way that we look to increase statistical power is to increase our sample size. But you'll see power analyses in a lot of research proposals, hopefully more in research publications, although I don't see that very often. Different way of doing research. So I talked about quantitative research for quite a while, I think, because there's a lot to kind of understand around that. It's got a lot of steps to it and a lot of different kinds of analyses, even though mathematically a lot of them can be equated. I think a lot of people find the quantitative analysis really difficult to understand, and also the way that you have to, again, methodologically design studies is really systematic and involves a lot of control, manipulation, all that kind of stuff. Qualitative research has its own challenges.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's a different kind of work.
Yeah. So qualitative research is the awareness of the diverse experience of individuals, and psychological qualitative research in particular forms a platform for exactly this, hearing the voices of the excluded.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So in this kind of work, researchers ask participants to describe their experiences in ways that are meaningful to them, rather than asking participants to kind of categorize themselves or use categories established by theories.
Yeah.
So, for example, there was a study, this one I think is the Kid and Crawl one, from 2002, I believe. And this one, was to gain insight into 29 Toronto street youth, ages 17 to 24 years, interviewed in 2002, and what they were really interested in was their experiences with suicide.
Yeah, I love the term street youth, by the way.
Street youth.
I hope that someday in my past life someone referred to me as street youth.
Yeah, and I think I said Toronto wrong. It's Toronto, isn't it? Torontonians say Toronto.
Okay.
So qualitative research would do different things with the narratives around the experiences that these street youths have, kind of described. One way to do that is to look at kind of themes, a thematic kind of analysis. So in this study, they looked at the central themes in the narrative. So they looked across all the different quotes, all the different narratives, and then picked out themes that were coming up over and over again, right? So it's a very iterative process, takes a lot of time, but they found 4 main themes: low self-worth, which was included in 74% of the narratives; isolation, which was in 61%; rejection and betrayal; and lack of control. And the authors presented the themes in this paper within the context that they were discussed in the interviews. So, for example, they looked at how often isolation appeared in discussion categories such as early childhood abuse. So how much did they say that early childhood abuse involved rejection and betrayal, isolation, and then gave quotes to give weight to that argument and to give evidence of what the person said in their own words. And I mean, one thing that they found was that there was a concept called kind of this slow suicide, where people's experiences really started to kind of accumulate, where they felt that there was a loss of control. There were things that people hadn't considered before, so assault during prostitution, drug abuse as being part of that slow suicide, breakups in intimate relationships being part of this kind of low self-worth, and rejection and betrayal. And it was, and a majority, 76% of those interviewed reported a history of, attempting suicide. And the narratives that they used were very revealing of a group of people that hadn't been looked at before in terms of like street youth. So what we understood about wanting to take your own life was expanded by this study, where we wouldn't have known about those given average levels.
You want to try and find something that you wouldn't find by coming to this with your own theory. Yeah,
exactly. So that's an example of that. So some high quality research can be done with things like interpretive phenomenological analysis. I think I said that right. Grounded theory, discourse analysis. Basically what they all do is to unpack the data. So they're unpacking those narratives and in a kind of deconstructed way. And they're searching for richness within those narratives, looking for multiple meanings and themes within those. And these differ, so IPA and grounded theory and discourse analysis and thematic analysis, they differ in the way that they emphasize, at least this is my understanding of them, they differ in the way they emphasize the researcher being positioned within that trail of analysis. So some of them, I think IPA is one of them, you do an interview, really unpack it, look for the meaning, but then place yourself as a researcher within that to understand how to then do the next level of analysis. So there's kind of a dual process in it. You're really understanding the person's experience and trying to understand that, but you're also understanding your placement within that research context.
Right. Much like a quantitative piece of research can never be totally free of bias. A qualitative piece of research has to be done by a human being. Yeah. Which means that, you do what you can to reduce.
Yeah. So you reflect after each of those. I mean, oftentimes, like my own trainees who are doing research like this, they after each interview, you realize where your biases were. Oh, I asked that question in a kind of leading way. What does that mean? How do I understand what their answers were based on the way that I asked the question? But also, how do I grow as a researcher and make sure that I don't introduce that bias in the next interview? So it's very much, you don't say, oh, I messed that up, completely throw it out. I mean, it's an iterative process and you work to understand it. And some of them, things like grounded theory work to then produce a model and a theory of what's going on. So it's very similar to the quantitative research. You're producing some kind of model of what you believe works in what way and what's the mediator. So it's not lower quality to do this qualitative research. You can come up with a model that would be maybe just as important as a model that we would have using that little like diagram with poverty and chaos. Yeah. And again, research should be applied or applicable in some way. I mean, sometimes it is just, basic research where's my mouse? Here. Basic research. So, the kind of research that just tells you some understanding about what humans are like, might guide some deductive theory about what's going on, which then affects and modifies the applied research that happens, which then leads to the human and social world changing or adapting in some way, which then leads to an interpretation and explanation that leads to more basic research on that concept.
Yeah, like why do people not put arrows on circle charts and just assume they'll go clockwise? There's a good human and social world context.
It took me a long time to understand this thing.
Right in front of me.
I had to go, wait, what? And then I didn't really no. It's not a great graph. But I think the concept is a good one. It was better than me having to just speak through some text.
The mouse helps. I think people have got it now that they've got the mouse.
Good.
Yeah, so...
do you think I'm just putting you on the spot, do you think that human echolocation stuff is anywhere in this chart?
Yeah, so there are now hundreds of people who navigate their everyday lives with human echolocation, and I would say that the research has done a couple of things by now that have reached end users. So, for example, Laura Toller's analysis of the waveforms of echolocation clicks, looking at exactly what sound is used by different expert human echolocators and what their experiences are, has kind of informed practice, right? So it's kind of helped people realize it's not just in your ears. A lot of the skill of doing this is actually in your ability to make a good click, right? So that's become a more
with your mouth. Yeah.
And so that's become something that's a skill that's being transmitted among users more once it's been kind of highlighted how important that actually is.
So what are you saying that that was the basic research that happened, was looking at the waveforms?
Yeah, which guides a deductive theory.
And was that driven by the human?
Yeah.
That was from certain experts who were able to use their mouth sounds to know where things are in their environment than
basically that study
basic
was
research.
Right. That study was more or less started just by Laura just listening as she talked to a lot of echolocators.
Yeah. Okay. So then, does that lead to a deductive theory?
Yeah. So it led to theory about, how the different ways you could have different power spectra in your click could lead to different reflections, which might give you different information or might make different information more clear, which is a deductive theory about how echolocation works in the physical world.
Okay. And then you can look to see if you can teach people how to use their mouths better.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. I wanted to get into a little bit about the political and structural issues that also guide research. So this is a lot of Marcus Munafo, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, from Bristol University's work. He's been doing a lot of stuff on what science is replicable, what incentive structures are making it so that we're finding a lot of scientific articles that are retracted because they were wrong. And so we know the current system rewards positive results. Just on Twitter this morning or last night, I saw somebody say the mental gymnastics that are happening now with pre-registering your study and saying this is what we're going to do with our study and this is where we expect to find, and then when they publish it and leaving things really vague in some parts just so that they're yeah, we can totally do more analyses. So that if we try to find more things, just so that we have a positive result somewhere. So even when we're trying to, get rid of some of these biases, they're still there. And, it rewards novelty. You'll article, like editors say, like, well, it's not novel enough, or, it's not sexy. I think some people have said, which is really gross.
Yeah, that's a really gross. Who said that to you? I'm sorry.
So yeah, I think this current system and how it rewards, publication quickly, many papers, and having those positive results that people are then going to talk about.
You got to make some noise. You got to get some eyeballs.
Yeah, I think, that then leads to questionable practices in research.
Absolutely.
So not being very clear about, your biases, lack of control for biases, not putting in alternative explanations, so that you can test those to make sure that your variable that you've chosen as the chosen one is like coming out on top. You're not like pitting it against anything else. Low statistical power, so just having fewer participants than what a power analysis would say. Stopping taking participants when you feel like they're the ones that are going to give you your significant
the
results.
data look good, I'll just stop. Yeah, don't do that.
And just a lack of transparency in how you're deciding when to stop, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or what you did and what you were thinking beforehand, because a lot of times people after the fact create stories. So, and I think a lot of this also is related to the, not just at the system level in terms of journal articles, but also in the universities. So what research gets kind of prioritized, even if it's not like a direct, you need to do research on this. You see that some of your colleagues maybe aren't retained, maybe are given redundancy. And you realize those people who are being hired or those who are retained are the ones who study certain
fMRI.
things. Yes.
All of them.
And the social psychologists are just leaving.
Yeah.
And so you start to go, oh, you know what? I need to bill myself more as a biological scientist, or, and, I mean, we're scientists and we're observers. So we realize when things are happening in our institutions. And we're also told, where are your research papers? Where are your research papers that are making a big impact in terms of other scientists referring to them in their research work?
Yes.
So, a lot of what we then decide to do might be based more on that, and affirming our pet theories and being known as the person who studies blah, 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 rather than going to maybe service users, the NHS, people who are just interested in and who are going to benefit from the research itself.
Right.
They're not having a feed on what's happening oftentimes, because we are put on a lot of pressure from the universities and from and from the scientific community as a whole. So we need to align training and incentives for career progression with scientific rigor, and not just the bare results.
Yes.
And I don't know how to do that.
We need to change the system, Luna. It's all part of the system.
I feel like I'm ending on but it's just the reality. When we talked about scientific context, I think, there's the historical, social cultural, the moral context, but there's also context, the context of the scientists.
I feel like stuff like registered reports are gaining momentum, and I don't think we want to spend a lot more time trying to talk about how to change the system. It says there is now widespread recognition that it needs changing.
Yeah.
And I would basically say you can expect science in psychology to look different in 5 or 10 years, if it even takes that long.
Yeah. Hopefully. And I think, if we train the next generation, I think it's going to be important.
Yeah.
So a lot of my presentation was taken from this Research Methods in Psychology 9th edition book, but also, just listening to Marcus on Twitter, but also he came up to University of Liverpool to give a seminar, so I found that deeply engaging. So if you get to see him, it's really good work. And also Steve Weatherhead, who does a lot of qualitative work at University of Liverpool, so it's where I got all my qualitative, because I really haven't delved into qualitative work much, although I am doing some Q-sort methodology. So you might see that in some of my publications in the future, or some of my trainees' proposals is looking at Q-sort, which is a kind of quantitative qualitative blend. So that's it. So maybe we should say goodbye and keep researching, keep learning.
And just remember, we have to change the system.
So go do that today.